Okay, so now we're in our science notebooks. I want you to open up to the next page. Go to the next blank page, which is page 8. So let's make that a little clearer. Page 8. Okay, there we are on page 8. So let's give this page a title. As always, we need to start with a title. So you skip 2 lines and draw a horizontal line. And we will say sexual reproduction of plants with spores. Long title, so leave some room. Sexual reproduction of plants with spores. So let's go to the table of contents and write that in. Sexual reproduction of plants with spores. Page 8 and today's date. Okay, now let's go back to our page. Great. So lots of things to talk about here. So we said sexual reproduction of plants with spores. So let's think, what plants have spores? Not all plants have spores. We know that ferns have spores on them, and mosses, some mosses, not all mosses. Okay, so now that we know what plants have spores, let's think about it. Let's think about how this happens. So spores are those parts of the plant, those little tiny dots that sit on the bottom of leaves, and they fly away, and then they will land somewhere. So let's start with that process. So we're going to draw a diagram. It's going to be a little challenging to follow along. So make sure that you're paying attention. Right now I'm drawing a fern. Here's a better picture of a fern so you can see. That's what a fern looks like. And under the leaves, there's those dots. So let's write that. I'm going to draw a fern. So I know that's just me trying my best, but it's okay if your fern doesn't look like a fern. We're just going to get as close as we can with our drawing skills. So I'm coloring it in. Now, what did we say at the bottom of these leaves? We said there were spores. So I'm going to draw them in. The bottom of leaves, there's spores. So I'm drawing in these dots called spores. I'm going to color them orange. Okay, so we have a fern with spores on it. And we said that these spores, when wind hits the plant, they'll fly away. So let's show that. We have a spore that flew off this plant, and now it's all by itself in the air, and then it lands somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to label our diagram so far. We have fern and spore. Now we should also say that this has a real name, a real scientific name. It is called a sporophyte. And not only a sporophyte, but a mature sporophyte, which means it has grown and it is able to produce these spores. a sporophyte. You see how spore is in the name? Let me write it down. Sporophyte. It has spores. That's what that means. Sporophyte. Sporophyte. It has spores. Okay. One of those spores goes out on its own, makes its life for itself, right? Maybe it's going off to college. Who knows? Now we're going on to the next thing. What happens with that? Well, it has to land on the ground. And when it lands on the ground, it will become a gametophyte. So, what is a gametophyte? I'm going to keep this orange so that you know that this is the spore becoming a gametophyte. So let's write gametophyte. So the spore that came away, it's now becoming a gametophyte. What is a gametophyte? A gametophyte has on it, it has an egg and it has sperm that just grow on it. Okay. So I'm going to color those in purple. Egg, sperm. So the spore became a gametophyte, which has egg and sperm. Now, there's something else we should know. The next thing that happens here, so I'm going to draw an arrow to represent going to the next thing, is, let me draw the gametophyte. Okay. The egg and sperm come together. So let me color it. So how can that happen? Well, the sperm have a whip-like tail and it can swim, right? So it has a whip-like tail called a flagella and it can swim to the egg and then they can come together. So that's how that happens. But how could it swim if the environment was not wet? So we need to know that in order for this to happen, so let's review. The spore comes off of the fern and it goes by itself and then becomes a gametophyte. But it will just end here. The process would just end here unless there was a moist environment. Now, if I didn't already say, I want you guys to be drawing in your notebook as well, because this is a complex process. So if you haven't been drawing, make sure to go back and start drawing. It's going to be helpful for you to understand what's going on if you're drawing with me. So, in order for the sperm to swim to the egg, you need a moist environment. What does moist mean? It means wet, damp. There needs to be water present. So, we know that ferns must be in wet, moist environments in order to reproduce. Because you need that moist, wet environment in order for the sperm to swim to the egg. Let's label this sperm, egg, egg, sperm. Okay, so now that the egg and the sperm are together, something really cool happens. So let's make an arrow to represent the next step. What's the next step? Well, you have your gametophyte still. Your gametophyte, that was once a spore that lived on this fern. The egg and the sperm began to form a embryo. So let's color that in. This is the gametophyte in orange, the sperm in egg, and then that black dot there, that's the embryo. Now, I can't color it in or else I would color it green. So, We still have the gametophyte. We still have the sperm and the egg, and then inside here is an embryo. What is an embryo? An embryo is the very beginning of a new plant, right? So it will be the very start of a new fern. Beautiful, huh? So the next thing that happens from this embryo is, let's draw an arrow to represent the next step. We have a gametophyte, still the same gametophyte, and that embryo, that dot right here, it starts to become a new plant, a new fern. So we have this gametophyte in orange still, and that sperm and egg came together and got an embryo, and that embryo became a new fern. Okay, so out of the gametophyte came a new fern. This is called if this is a new fern, and this is called a sporophyte, a fern is a sporophyte, what's another name we can call this? We can call this a new sporophyte. All right, and then this little sporophyte is going to grow, and eventually this will seem so tiny, this gametophyte that it came from, it will just break away and die, but this new sporophyte will grow until it becomes a mature fern, a mature sporophyte that has those spores on it. So what happens from here to here? It grows, right? So this is a very complex process. So let's think about it and go through it one more time. We start with a fern. A fern is also called a sporophyte. Why is it called a sporophyte? Because it contains spores. So a fern is a sporophyte. Okay, the spores sit under the leaves. And then one of those spores, or maybe more, but this is just so you can see what happens. Let's say one of these spores flies away because the wind takes it. Let's write in wind. The wind takes that spore, and then that spore lands in some moist environment, and it becomes a gametophyte. What is a gametophyte? It's a spore that has an egg and a sperm. So that spore develops into a gametophyte, which has an egg and a sperm. Now, what happens? The egg and the sperm come together because the sperm swims to the egg. How is it able to do that? It has a tail that moves around and can swim. Like if you've ever tried to swim, I love to swim. There's a stroke called the butterfly, and your feet move like this, just like the tail would. The tail is called a flagella. So the egg and the sperm come together, and the sperm swims to the egg. How is that possible? You needed that moist environment. Without this wet, moist environment, the sperm would not be able to swim to the egg, and the process would just end there. But let's say you did have that moist environment, and the egg and the sperm came together. Then what happens when they come together? An embryo is formed. What is an embryo? It's the very beginning of a new plant. So now we move on to the next thing. Over time, that embryo grows and it becomes a new sporophyte. Now this is a tiny one. This is still the gametophyte, but it will grow and grow and grow until it becomes a new fern. And it's just as big as this, and it produces its own spores. So that is the sexual reproduction of plants with spores. A lot to learn here, a lot to absorb, but I hope you guys get it. Why don't you try to check your understanding assignment and let me know if you have questions.